Most people spend their entire lives working toward retirement, saving, planning, believing that one day, the hardest part of life will finally be behind them. Richard Bennett believed the same thing. After more than 3 decades of building his business, he thought he was approaching the reward for a lifetime of work. Instead, at 58 years old, everything collapsed, his business failed, his savings disappeared. The office he had walked into almost every morning for 30 years closed its doors. Employees he had worked beside for decades packed their belongings into cardboard boxes and quietly went home. Suppliers stopped calling. Customers moved on. The phone that had once rung constantly suddenly became silent. Friends tried to comfort him. "You've done enough. Maybe it's time to slow down. You don't have to prove anything anymore." Some even called it bad luck. Others called it the natural end of a long career. Almost everyone believed Richard's best years were behind him. Richard listened, then quietly disagreed, because he believed something most people never stop to consider. Losing money doesn't erase experience, losing a business doesn't erase wisdom, and losing everything you've built doesn't mean you've lost the ability to build again. Experience doesn't disappear with bankruptcy. Neither does discipline. Neither does character. While others saw a man reaching the end of his career, Richard saw someone carrying more knowledge than he had ever possessed before. So instead of filling out retirement paperwork, he opened a blank notebook. Instead of searching for comfort, he started searching for opportunity. He had no investors, no financial safety net, no guarantee that anyone would trust a 58-year-old entrepreneur who had already lost everything once. The odds couldn't have looked worse, yet Richard often said something that surprised everyone who heard it. "I wasn't starting from zero. I was starting from experience." Years later, the company he built after losing everything would become even more successful than the one he had spent decades creating. Business magazines called it an extraordinary comeback. Richard never liked that description, because to him, the greatest victory wasn't rebuilding the company. It was finding the courage to begin again when almost everyone else believed the story was already over. But to understand how the most successful chapter of Richard Bennett's life began at 58, we have to go back to the day he locked the door of his old office for the very last time. This is his story. Richard Bennett never dreamed of building an empire. He simply wanted to build something that would last. Fresh out of college, he started with a tiny office, one desk, one telephone, one customer willing to take a chance on someone with more determination than experience. The early years weren't glamorous. There were months when paying employees meant Richard went without a paycheck himself. There were weekends spent working instead of resting, vacations postponed, family dinners interrupted by client calls. Like many entrepreneurs, he measured success one small victory at a time. One satisfied customer, one new contract, one employee hired, then another. Slowly, the business grew. Not overnight, but steadily, year after year. Richard became known as someone who always kept his word. Customers stayed because they trusted him. Employees stayed because they respected him. Many joined the company in their 20s and were still there decades later. The office became more than a workplace. It became part of Richard's life. He celebrated birthdays there, watched young employees become managers, saw colleagues get married, raise families, and retire. The company wasn't simply where he worked. It was where much of his life had unfolded. Without even realizing it, the business slowly became part of his identity. When people asked who Richard Bennett was, his answer was almost always connected to the company he had spent more than 30 years building. In his mind, the future seemed clear. One day he would gradually step back, hand over more responsibility, watch the next generation continue what he had started. The business wasn't just his career. It was his retirement plan, his legacy, the reward for decades of sacrifice. Then, the world changed. Customer behavior shifted. Technology transformed the industry. New competitors appeared almost overnight. Markets that had once felt predictable suddenly became uncertain. The changes came faster than anyone expected, faster than Richard had prepared for. For the first time in more than 30 years, The company that had always found a way forward began losing ground. At first, it seemed temporary, just another difficult season. Richard had survived challenges before. He believed he would survive this one too. He had no idea that the greatest challenge of his entire career was only beginning. Richard tightened expenses, postponed investments, worked longer hours than he had in decades. He met personally with long-time clients, renegotiated contracts, searched for new markets, introduced new services if there was a possible solution. Richard tried it, but the numbers refused to improve. Month after month, revenue declined, debt increased. Customers who had been loyal for years quietly disappeared. Every decision became more difficult than the last. Which bills could wait? Which employees could stay? How much longer could the company survive? Richard carried those questions home every night. Sleep became rare. The office lights were often still on long after everyone else had gone home. He wasn't ready to give up. Not on the business, not on the people who had trusted him with their careers, but eventually reality became impossible to ignore. The company had reached the point where staying open would only make things worse. So Richard scheduled one final meeting. Employees gathered in the conference room they had shared for years. Some had worked beside him for decades. Others had built their entire careers inside that company. Richard stood at the front of the room. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Then, with a voice heavier than anyone had ever heard before, he told them the truth. The company was closing. Silence filled the room. Some lowered their heads. Others quietly wiped away tears. No one blamed him. They knew how hard he had fought. When the meeting ended, people hugged one another, packed family photographs, cleared their desks, turned off their computers for the last time. By evening, the office was almost empty. Richard walked slowly through each room, past the conference table where hundreds of meetings had taken place, past the desks where friendships had been built, past the walls that had witnessed more than 30 years of his life. Then he reached the front door. He looked back one final time, slipped the keys into the lock, turned them slowly. The familiar sound echoed through the empty office. For 30 years. Those keys had opened the door to his life's work. Now, he was locking it forever. Richard placed the keys in his pocket, picked up a small cardboard box, and quietly walked away. Most people believed they had just watched the end of Richard Bennett's story. They were wrong without realizing it. They had just witnessed the end of the first chapter. The most extraordinary chapter was still waiting to be written. Imagine losing everything, not at 25, not at 30, but at 58. Would you have the courage to begin again? Or would you believe your story was already over? Because that's exactly what Richard has to decide. And the choice he makes changes everything. Subscribe if you haven't already. We publish a brand new business story every single day. Now let's see how a man who lost everything rebuilt something even greater. The weeks after closing the company were the hardest of Richard's life. For the first time in more than 30 years, he had nowhere to be on Monday morning, no office to unlock, no employees waiting for direction, no customers expecting a call. The silence felt unfamiliar. For a while, Richard questioned everything. Had he waited too long to adapt? Had he made too many mistakes? Was everyone else right? Was 58 simply too old to start again? Then one morning, he opened the same notebook he had begun writing in after the company closed. Instead of listing everything he had lost, he wrote down everything he still had. 3 decades of experience, thousands of customer conversations, hundreds of business mistakes, relationships built over a lifetime, lessons that no university could teach. That simple exercise changed the way he saw himself. He wasn't starting with money, but he wasn't starting with nothing either. Richard knew he couldn't compete with younger entrepreneurs in every way. Many had more energy, more time, more willingness to take risks, so he stopped trying to compete on youth. Instead, he competed on experience. He began studying the industry with fresh eyes this time, not as someone trying to protect an existing company, but as someone free to question everything. He noticed mistakes that newer businesses kept repeating, problems customers complained about year after year, services competitors continued to overlook. He also noticed something else. Many companies had become so focused on technology that they had forgotten the value of relationships. They chased efficiency. Richard remembered trust. They automated conversations. Richard remembered people's names. They measured transactions. Richard remembered loyalty. The more he observed, the clearer the opportunity became. The market hadn't stopped needing great businesses. It had simply stopped seeing customers as people. Slowly, an idea began taking shape. Not a copy of the company he had lost. Something better, smaller, smarter, built around everything failure had taught him. He didn't rush. He had learned that rushing often creates the very mistakes experience is supposed to prevent. So he planned carefully, tested ideas, spoke with former customers, asked more questions than he answered. For the first time in years, Richard wasn't trying to save a business. He was designing one. Looking back, he often said that losing his first company forced him to ask a question he had avoided for decades. If I had to build it all again today, what would I do differently? The answer to that question became the foundation of everything that followed, because Richard wasn't rebuilding the past. He was building the company he wished he had created the first time. At first, the new business grew quietly. Richard wasn't trying to impress anyone. He simply focused on solving problems better than he had before. Former customers noticed. Many remembered the way Richard had always treated them. They trusted him long before they trusted the new company. One by one they came back, not because of nostalgia, because they believed in the person behind the business. Soon, former employees started calling. Some had found other jobs, others had changed industries, but many asked the same question. Do you have room for one more? Richard smiled every time he heard it. Years earlier, those same people had walked out of the old office carrying cardboard boxes. Now, they were walking into a new beginning. The new company carried less debt, made decisions more carefully, adapted faster, listened to customers more closely, and never assumed yesterday's success guaranteed tomorrow's survival. Word spread quickly. Customers recommended the business. New opportunities appeared. Even investors who had once doubted Richard's future began requesting meetings. Richard politely listened, then made every decision with patience. He had learned that the wrong partnership can be just as dangerous as the wrong strategy. Within just a few years, the company expanded faster than anyone expected, not because Richard worked harder. It grew because he made wiser decisions. Every failure had become a lesson. Every setback had become a better decision. The failure that ended his first business became the education that made his second one extraordinary. Years later, visitors often noticed something unusual inside Richard's office. Tucked inside the top drawer of his desk was an old set of office keys. The metal had become worn. The keychain was scratched. They looked ordinary, almost forgotten. One afternoon, a young employee noticed them and asked, "Why do you still keep those?" Richard smiled. He picked up the keys, turned them slowly in his hand. For a moment, he simply looked at them. Then he quietly replied, "Those keys don't open any doors anymore." He paused. "But they remind me that sometimes you have to close one life before you can build another." The room fell silent. Those keys had once locked the office he believed he would retire from, the business he thought would define the rest of his life. Now, they reminded him of something very different, not what he had lost, but everything he had learned. Looking back, Richard often shared a lesson that people never forgot. "I didn't rebuild because I was fearless," he smiled, glancing once more at the keys resting in his hand, then quietly finished the thought. "I rebuilt because giving up would have meant wasting everything failure had taught me." To most people, those old keys represented the end of a business. To Richard, they represented the beginning of the best chapter of his life. Richard's story reminds us that it's never too late to begin again. Age doesn't determine what's still possible. Your willingness to keep moving does sometimes. The greatest advantage you have isn't money. It's everything life has already taught you. Subscribe to Profit and Peril for more stories like this one, and tell me in the comments if you had to start over today What's the first thing you would build? I read every single one. Come back tomorrow. The next story might change the way you think.